Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman, in our Jerusalem office. Lazar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Amanda. Good to be here.
It is so good to be back. I was gone for about a week and I really missed our chats. So thanks for spending some time with me today when it is, can I say, it's your birthday?
It was my birthday this week. Yep. Indeed it is. So thank you so much for those wishes.
So Mazel Tov to Lazar. So this week, Israel has had a revolving roster of high-level officials visiting the country, and starting with U.S. President Donald Trump's arrival on Monday of last week, actually. So we saw this week the arrival of Trump's senior Mideast advisors, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, also Vice President JD Vance and his lovely wife, Usha, and also U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. But while the traffic was really snarled across the country, a controversial member of Knesset named Avi Maoz brought an equally controversial bill that the Knesset passed in a preliminary reading on Wednesday. So we're going to talk about this bill a little later in the program, but it essentially would apply Israeli sovereignty to all of the West Bank settlements. There was another bill that was more limited that would annex a major city settlement called Ma'ale Adumim. This is extremely interesting timing, especially as there are murmurs that Israel is indeed a client or vassal state of the United States. One may think that the timing was not coincidental. So we're going to talk about all of this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. After a meeting in Jerusalem on Wednesday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. Vice President JD Vance rejected claims that Israel is an American, quote, client state, and emphasized their partnership in working to implement Washington's plan to end the war in the Gaza Strip. Why would people even begin to suggest, however, Lazar, that Israel is a, quote, client, or I like to think of it as a vassal state?
Oh, that's actually a good word, the vassal state. I've been saying client state. But, this is something that when you look back across Israel's history has come up. But let's talk about why it's coming up right now. We're at the end of, I don't know if we're at the end. Donald Trump says we're at the end of this 2-year war. We're certainly at a very significant pause, and the chances are decent that this is indeed the end of the war in Gaza, at least the October 7th war. The end of the war, I think it's pretty obvious to all, was imposed in some ways on Israel by President Trump, by Washington. Now, that in and of itself is not the worst thing in the world, because the terms of his plan are essentially a surrender document for Hamas. If indeed the plan is implemented in its entirety, and there's no guarantee of that, then Israel has won the war. Hamas is no longer running the Gaza Strip. It is no longer has its weapons, and we've gotten the living hostages back, and there's still 13 more slain hostages to get back. That's not the big problem. The reason why it's come up recently is because in the details of this plan and in the implementation, at least in the first phase, and in Israel's enforcement of it, that's when you're starting to see the U.S. really limit what Israel can do, and those murmurs are starting to get louder and louder. So, for example, there's been some serious Hamas violations of the ceasefire. Most significantly, of course, is the failure to return in the first 72 hours the 28 slain hostages, and then the slow roll afterward, and that attack on Sunday morning in Rafah, which killed 2 IDF soldiers. And it wasn't the only attack that day. In response to the deadly attack, Israel started airstrikes and basically was gearing up for a very significant response. And by the end of the day, under U.S. pressure, the IDF said that the ceasefire is back in effect. So you're seeing that even in the enforcement of this and Israel's determination to show that, if Hamas doesn't follow the terms of this deal, and even stop attacking Israeli soldiers, then it'll pay a price. That Israel's not able to do that. So that is certainly something that is extremely uncomfortable for Israel. It doesn't make Israel look very strong. And then, if our readers remember, the when Vance came here, it was on Tuesday. He went straight down to Kiryat Gat. Why would the vice president go to Kiryat Gat? Why would anyone go to Kiryat Gat? He was there because that is the place where this new U.S.-backed command center or coordination center for the ceasefire is there. Now, the U.S. is going through great efforts to make it seem like an Israeli-American joint thing. It's so clearly an American project where Israel has a lot of presence, has a lot of, has a lot of input, but it's certainly an American project. I was there when the vice president was there. It feels American. All the rules, all the signs, all these signs in English that are written in American military ease. And when I asked Vice President Vance about the potential for Turkish troops, now he said Israel will decide which foreign troops are here, but then he also said that Turkey has a very positive role to play. So given the very strong ties between Erdogan and Trump in Washington and Ankara, it seems like Washington certainly sees Turkey as part of the solution and is determined to have them be part of this post-war force in some way, something that Israel would never accept on its own. We'll have to see what happens there. But the pattern is that Washington decides that what happens in Gaza moving forward really is decided in Washington, in the White House, and not in Jerusalem. And that is something which people, within the government and even, critics of the government, obviously, are becoming increasingly vocal about.
Okay, the center in Kiryat Gat, it's really intriguing to me. And I don't know if I've ever told you, Laser, but when I was about 17, I served as an au pair with a woman who was in the American military and in Europe. She was stationed in Europe. And I went for about a month and a half traveling from US Army base to US Army base throughout Europe, taking care of her 3-year-old son. And so I kind of got a sense of what these different stations can look like abroad. And I wonder, do you think that this is the end game, that there's going to be some kind of US military operation permanently in Israel from now on?
No, I don't think so. Trump has promised, and it's really been part of his, general campaign, his general outlook that, fewer U.S. troops abroad. There's going to be no U.S. boots on the ground in Gaza. So that's looking for the long term. But I could see a reality, and I would even put money on this, that as long as Trump is still in office, so for the next 3 years plus, then this ceasefire mechanism will be there, because I don't expect Gaza to be solved within the next 3 years. Best case scenario, Hamas is disarmed, at least officially. We're well into standing up a new moderate government, and some sort of rebuilding has begun. But that's, again, a best case scenario.
Let's compare and contrast a little bit this civilian military coordination center with the situation that we have had in the north in Lebanon. We have, UNIFIL in Lebanon, which is, of course, a much more built out situation and militarized than what we're seeing right now in Kiryat Gat. And in that case, their bases are inside Lebanon, correct? So I wonder, I mean, obviously there's the danger aspect of not having the center inside Gaza, but I wonder why Israel was chosen and not, for example, another third party such as Egypt.
Well, so UNIFIL is a peacekeeping force. It serves a different function than this center. Now, this center, or the people within the center, will likely create that international stabilization force, which could be based in Israel, like some U.S. peacekeeping operations are, or it could be based in the Gaza Strip, depending on security. But they will do most of their work in the Gaza Strip. So this is a little bit different. This is dealing with humanitarian. This is dealing with violations of the ceasefire, where troops are. So it's a little bit different than UNIFIL. But I will say that UNIFIL was not very effective. And, international peacekeeping forces in Israel's history have not been very effective.
Okay, so let's move on and dig in a little bit more into this idea of Israel being a client state. And there's been a lot of buzz, of course. And I mean, I think a lot of it can maybe be attributed to just US President Donald Trump's rhetoric, the way he speaks. Because, for example, in a recent Time magazine interview, which was released today, I think it was, or this week at least, Trump said that he made Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stop fighting in the war, and otherwise it would have continued for years, meaning Trump is the only mechanism that caused this war to cease. But obviously, Israel is a sovereign nation, and there had to be some decision making behind the idea to actually wind down the war. What do you think about this idea that it's the Trump rhetoric that's feeding this idea that Israel is a vassal state?
So Trump certainly likes to take credit, but here I don't think he's wrong. There was definitely some pushback from Netanyahu. He's shaping the deal, but were it not for Trump's getting all the pro-Western Arab countries together and getting everyone behind this and then applying pressure to Netanyahu, then I think it's pretty obvious that we wouldn't be where we are right now. There wouldn't be this ceasefire. So Trump is right to take credit there. But this is not out of step or out of character for the what American presidents do during Israel's war. This really goes back to the war of attrition. So after the Six-Day War, there was combat between the Egyptians and Israel, Syria and Israel from 68 to 1970. And under the U.S.-backed Rogers Plan, that was how the Egyptians and the Israelis stopped fighting across the Suez Canal. Now, there as well, Israel would have liked to have continued. They were forced to basically stop by the Americans. And after they stopped, the Egyptians moved some of their advanced Soviet air defense batteries right up to the canal, something that Israel saw, Israel complained about. The U.S. said, we didn't see it, because they were determined to stop the fighting, right? And a couple months later, when Israel was finally able to convince them that the Egyptians had done this, they said, why do you want to, you want to start attacking again? We already have, it's been quiet. Why do you want to start the fighting again? And this actually harmed Israel very significantly, because in 1973, 3 years later, that's what made it so hard to target the crossing, and what cost a lot of Israeli pilots their lives, the fact that those SAM batteries were so far forward. So we can see starting there, though the U.S. can be a very important partner in creating and ending these conflicts that Israel doesn't necessarily know how to do itself, it could also do so on terms that are not what Israel would want.
Right. And so take us a little bit forward into, obviously Biden had a lot of influence on the way that this particular war was played out.
Right. So, he had influence on the war, the way the war was fought. He was not able to bring an end to the war. That's for sure. But other presidents did. Let's say in 1973, right? Israel had the Egyptian Third Army surrounded. It wanted to probably fight for another week, maybe even a little bit less, to destroy the Third Army. It was cut off. And the Nixon administration, which had been so supportive of Israel and had sent that airlift that kept Israel in the fight, allowed them to win on the battlefield, they said, no, you're not going to destroy the Third Army. Now, why did the Nixon administration insist on that? Because they wanted to make sure that the Egyptians were going to move over from the Soviet sphere to the American sphere. And that's what happened. That's what worked. That's what led to the Egyptian-Israeli peace deal. But there's still feelings in Israel that Egypt never felt like that they lost the war. And had the Third Army been destroyed, the narrative would have been very different. So that was certainly the case there from a very supportive president. And you can just move forward through Israel's history. You see in 1982 in the first Lebanon war, it kind of echoes what happens now, that Reagan, again, very supportive of Israel, he saw a picture of a child that looked like it had its arms blown off, right? And he said he said this is like another Holocaust, and he said he used that language intentionally. Turns out the picture, the child's its arms were bandaged in white bandages. That's why it looked like they were missing. And it wasn't from an Israeli attack; it was from a Palestinian attack. But those images had already affected the way Reagan saw the war, and he insisted that Israel end it much earlier than they wanted before they reached their intended aims. Now there was pictures coming out of Gaza of very sick, very emaciated children who had pre-existing conditions, but that was used as evidence by a lot of world leaders, to recognize a Palestinian state and call for an end to the war, because they thought they were just starving because food wasn't coming in. So there were some similarities there as well. And you can keep moving forward through history. Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, where there was those allegations of a massacre in Jenin, which didn't happen. That really spooked the Bush administration. There was pressure on Israel to stop. And then you look at 2006, the second Lebanon war, where after there was an incident in the village of Kana, where I think it was something between 20 and 30 civilians were killed. The initial reports were much higher, that they started insisting that Israel wind down the war, and it was wound down without a clear victory. I was speaking to Michael Oren, a military historian, former ambassador to Washington from Israel, and the way he says is, America never lets Israel win all the way. They always stop Israel too early. There's other people that disagree with that say that it's an important tool because Israel's not great at ending its own wars, right? And that is Israel has some control here. If Israel was clear about what it wanted in wars, so what is the aim, and how does the use of military force realistically lead to that aim, then they wouldn't have this pressure. This is an argument. I'm not necessarily endorsing it, but there's something there, I think. That when the U.S. doesn't understand what exactly Israel wants and Israel's not able to explain it, then they say, okay, we understand you've done a lot, but we're going to wrap it up for you, and we're actually going to try to help you gain what you're telling us what you want. And then Israel starts complaining about it. And it might even be something that is convenient for Israeli leaders. They can blame the U.S. when they haven't gotten everything, but that was because they were either not clear about their goals, or they set goals without being clear about how they wanted to get there. So I think that's an important way to think about what is happening in Gaza. I think the goals were clear and perfectly reasonable. It's not. There's people that say Hamas. How could you defeat Hamas? It's an idea, or it's a guerrilla organization. Bad ideas can be defeated. Guerrillas can be defeated. It's not a problem. The question is the military plan that the government approved, was it designed properly to bring about those aims? I'm not sure of that. So it could be that the best chance of actually getting its aims was to do 80%, 90% of the work militarily, but it needed the U.S. to actually bring this home and to wrap the deal up. And you could imagine, if Trump hadn't done this, how much longer it would have gone on. There's no guarantee that any of these aims would have been met. But again, there's still no guarantee that Hamas is going to disarm or Gaza be demilitarized.
Or that we'll get all of these hostages back.
I think Israel understands that there are some of the slain hostages that Hamas doesn't know where they are, and they're just not going to be retrievable because they're under ruins. So that, I think, is likely anyway. But looking forward, the disarmament demilitarization is going to be very complex, and as of now, it's still not clear. I think the U.S. doesn't know how they're going to do it yet, and that's a lot of what's going on in this center in Kiryat Gat.
Okay, let's go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Lazar, you've been talking a lot of history, and I want to cast our minds back to something that happened, I think it was in 2010, when then Vice President Joe Biden came on a visit to Israel and was shocked and dismayed by the vote to increase the houses in the Ramat Shlomo neighborhood of Jerusalem, which is over the Green Line. And it spawned this kind of mini diplomatic incident. Very similar kind of rhetoric and feelings came out of Washington that we're seeing this week. Can you talk a little bit about the differences, though, of what happened this week versus what happened in Biden's visit way back when?
Yeah, so Biden's visit, he was seen as the pro-Israel figure that knows everyone in Israel in the Obama administration. So we know there was tensions with the Obama administration. It really did not start off well at all. Obama went to Cairo, gave a speech which was seen as very problematic for Israel, didn't go to Israel. And then there was a series of other policies and decisions that upset the Israelis. So he sent Biden there to calm things down. It was a very warm visit. And then the Interior Ministry had this technical process where they approved 1,600 apartments. And the fact that, Netanyahu tried to explain how it wasn't in his control, he didn't even know about it, didn't matter. Biden released a very toughly worded statement. So there are those similarities here that, first of all, a messy coalition system and a democracy, the prime minister does not control everybody, doesn't even control his own coalition. And it's, there's limits to his power, even though the prime minister is very powerful. And it was a vice presidential trip, and one that was very positive and really colored it at the end. I will say there's a difference in that Vance was not releasing a statement. He was at the end of a press conference. He had tried to leave, and someone yelled out one more question, and then he answered it. So it wasn't like he was determined to say this, although Marco Rubio did say something more orderly. But the big difference here is you have a very friendly administration toward Israel, historically so, that this is coming. So there's been other disagreements, but it's not like the Trump administration is looking for fights with Israel. So I think they've made their point, and I very much imagine that Netanyahu is going to take that message to heart and is going to make sure this doesn't get in the way of the Gaza issue and issues like Iran that he's focused on. But it's a political price he might have to pay, and we're moving into election season, so this is perilous for Netanyahu. But that's the big difference. The Obama administration versus the Trump administration, you really can't compare the two in terms of their approach toward Israel.
Okay, but I wonder, I mean, if you look at the statements coming out from, for example, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is reminding President Trump in a tweet that Israel is a sovereign and independent state, and that, quote, members of the Knesset vote according to their own discretion. You have to wonder if this is also coordinated as a way of, I mean, obviously the campaigning has begun long ago for the October 2026 elections. And I just wonder if this is starting to be some kind of murmuring on the ground from the right to oust Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
So if we make it to October 2026, that's, the longest it can go. It could even happen before. I don't know if they're trying to oust him. I think they're trying to move him, right? So Ben-Gvir, and the right wing of the coalition, they support Netanyahu, but they say we need to be elected so that we can keep him on the right, because he has this tendency to float all over the place. So we need to be strong in the coalition and hold him to his promises. That's what I see this as. But you're going to hear more and more. You hear criticism from the right. I assume we're going to hear criticism from the opposition on this as well, that Netanyahu doesn't really know how to manage the relationship. And there is also going to be criticism, there has started to be coalition criticism about this client state thing from both sides as well. That, Netanyahu refuses to act in Israel's interest because he's just listening to what Trump says. And you kind of heard that with opposition leader, former prime minister, potential, major rival for Netanyahu in these elections, Naftali Bennett, when he was criticizing Netanyahu over reports that Hamas was picking half of the new Palestinian technocratic structure, basically saying you're going along too much or too loyally with Trump, and you're not actually standing up for Israel. So I think Netanyahu is going to get this from the coalition and also from the opposition. Very tough situation to be in, but he is putting all of his chips on the relationship with Trump. So far, it's working for him.
I want to go back to something that you said a little earlier, that in at least one of the cases, and this is following along with what Michael Oren was saying as well, that Israel doesn't get to actually finish the job, doesn't get to win fully. And just in conversations I've been having with people who fought in the reserves and especially their wives, there's a sense, at least from what I'm hearing, that Israel did not finish the job and that there is a willingness to go back and finish, and that Israel is being held back by the U.S. Are you hearing that as well?
Oh, there's certainly, and that isn't even now, that throughout the war, but that runs up against this argument that we heard from a lot of people that getting the living hostages back was more important, right? And it was always clear that if you get the living hostages back, you're not going to be able to, or it'll be much harder to militarily defeat Hamas, and you're going to have to, best case, do it through the agreement that gets them out, and that's where we are. So if the same people who are making the argument that we need to go in now are making the argument that we should end the war to bring out the living hostages, I think that's just not, that's inconsistent. But there are certainly plenty of voices who prioritize defeating Hamas, and they would say that, this is the time and we really have to finish the job. There's a lot to be said for that. But Netanyahu is this is what the U.S. is asking him to. Let this process, this work, play itself out. Don't let the smaller incidents get in the way of it, because there's something much bigger here. You hear Trump and Vance promise that Hamas will be defeated, that will be disarmed, that Hamas will be Gaza will be demilitarized, and then that we will move toward peace with other Arab states. So they're asking Netanyahu to focus on the big picture, and so far he is.
Since you are a diplomatic correspondent, I have one final question for you. I know you want to jet, but obviously there was a push at the beginning of, or in September to recognize a Palestinian state. And in many ways, Israel said at that point that it was a prize for Hamas. And at that time, it felt to me that world leaders seemed to believe that Hamas was some kind of player on the international diplomatic board. And now, since the war has been, at least the ceasefire has broken out, we saw, of course, that Hamas took to the streets and wantonly murdered all of its rivals. And I wonder if there's any kind of murmurings in the international echelons from the leadership or from diplomats in general saying, maybe Hamas is actually a terrorist organization that just kills its own people.
Listen, I think a lot of the world, recognizes Hamas as a terrorist organization and understands what they are. Certainly, October 7th really was scandalized people, and they'd never seen anything like that in their lives. So there's no question they understand what it is. The fact that they're doing it so brazenly and openly and proudly, I do think reemphasizes what Israel has been saying. There's no future for anyone here for peace, not for the Palestinians, not for the Israelis, as long as Hamas is armed. So I think Hamas is really misreading the situation here and did itself no favors. They could even have done this quietly. If they were determined to go shoot people in the face, they should have done it, in cellars and stuff, and made sure it wasn't in front of crowds. But yeah, I think that it's something like that really touches Trump too. He's an emotional. He reacts emotionally to things. So he saw the October 7th videos, and that really cemented this vision of what Hamas is. And now that he's seen these, at first he was making excuses, but now he says they got to stop. And yeah, it's I think we all knew what Hamas was, but hopefully, the world is seeing this. But we're not seeing any marches against it, so the hypocrisy is there as well. But I think this underlines that Hamas has to go one way or the other. Hopefully, what Trump is promising will actually come true, and he's going to remain committed to this. But if not, at some point, Israel has to decide whether it's going to protect its own interests or whether it's going to keep continuing with a program that's not working. Again, that's in the future. So far, there's no evidence that it's not working. There's obviously growing pains and all sorts of things that need to be arranged. But at some point, if we're way down the line and Hamas is still walking around and shooting people, threatening Israel and establishing its governance, then Israel's going to have some very tough decisions to make.
Lazar, thank you so much for bringing me up to date after my week off from the podcast sphere here at the Times of Israel.
Well, we're glad to have you back, and I'm looking forward to some more fascinating discussions in the coming weeks.
For sure. Shabbat Shalom and Mazal Tov, Lazar.
And Mazal Tov to you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, Shalom.